Ever feel like you're living in the shadow of the good old days?
Yeah, like even if you weren't actually around to, experience them firsthand.
Exactly. And today we're really diving deep into that feeling with Faria by Anna Iris Simon.
It's a memoir, right?
Yeah, but it's also about so much more than just one person's life. It gets into family, tradition, and what happens when we start thinking maybe, just maybe, progress isn't always a straight line upwards.
And it really struck a chord, didn't it? Freya became the surprise bestseller, especially with younger readers in Spain.
Totally. And I think it's because it taps into the sense of like collective nostalgia, but also this uncertainty about the future, you know, and that feeling, well, it's something a lot of people can relate to no matter where they're from. So from the very first page, Simon throws you headfirst into this world of her family, the Basuderos. And let me tell you, this isn't your grandma's knitting circle.
Oh, no, definitely not. We're talking generations of market vendors, their lives spent traveling from town to town, hawking their ware.
Living life on the road, haggling the whole 9 yards.
Simon really paints this incredibly vivid picture of their day-to-day existence.
And she doesn't sugarcoat anything either.
Yep.
It's life in all its messy, chaotic glory, like they literally lived in their truck.
Can you imagine a whole family crammed into this tiny space, on the move all the time?
Let's talk about cozy. And she talks about the smells, the constant chaos. It's almost like you're right there with them, feeling the dust and hearing the sounds of the market.
It's incredibly immersive.
You know what detail really got me? Simon mentions this photograph her grandfather always carried with him. It was a picture of him with, get this, a policeman and a gypsy.
Oh, wow.
All squeezed together, sharing a laugh like old pals.
Yeah.
What do you think that says about the Spain she grew up in? A Spain that's maybe fading away now.
That's interesting. I think it speaks to a sense of community that maybe we don't see as much anymore. This kind of easy familiarity that cut across social boundaries, people from totally different walks of life, just like connecting as human beings.
Right, like a casual intimacy that feels harder to come by these days.
Totally. And that's part of what makes Simon's story so poignant, I think. She's wrestling with the loss of that world, even though she knows it wasn't perfect, some kind of utopia or whatever.
Totally. It's that bittersweet feeling of looking back on something with fondness, even with all its flaws.
Exactly.
And that tension between nostalgia and progress really comes alive when she starts talking about her own childhood, growing up in Spain in the 80s and 90s. I mean, think about it. This is a Spain transitioning out of the Franco era, joining the European Union. Massive changes.
Oh, yeah, huge. And for a kid, I imagine those changes could be both exciting and maybe a little scary.
Absolutely. And to illustrate that feeling, she tells this very relatable story about, of all things, wanting Actimel yogurt.
Actimel. Okay.
So picture this. Actimel had just hit the shelves in Spain, and it was like the coolest, most modern snack a kid could have. But Simon's dad, yeah, he was not having it. He was totally horrified by the idea.
Really? Just because it was a newfangled yogurt?
Well, it was more than just the yogurt itself. It represented this whole wave of consumerism, of new possibilities, but also this departure from the traditional way of doing things. And for her dad, who represented those older traditions, it was a lot to handle,
Okay, that makes sense.
It's like classic generational clash, but on a yogurt level.
I love that. So we have this seemingly insignificant yogurt acting as this, symbol of bigger changes happening in society.
Precisely. And this tiny anecdote actually speaks to a larger anxiety that Simon grapples with throughout the book. It's this feeling that her generation is being handed a world full of opportunities, sure, but also a world that's maybe lost something essential along the way. Like, she even talks about longing for the days when families actually sat down to eat together, when life moved at a slower, more deliberate pace, before the age of smartphones and constant distractions.
That's so interesting, that yearning for a simpler time.
It's a pretty universal feeling, right? This idea that the grass is always greener on the other side.
Totally.
But here's the thing about Faria, and what sets it apart. Simon isn't trying to romanticize the past. She's asking these really tough questions about what we sacrifice in the name of progress. And that leads us to this whole other layer of her story, this idea of the weight of expectations and how those expectations clash with the realities of her generation.
You mean like the expectations that are placed upon her?
Exactly.
I'm hooked. Tell me more.
It's like, when you're a kid and you just want something so bad it consumes you. For Simon, that was Actimel, but On a deeper level, it makes you think about all the things we crave, we yearn for, even if they seem kind of silly on the surface.
Oh, totally. And often those cravings, they point to something much deeper, right? Like our desires, our anxieties about fitting in, about keeping up with the times.
Exactly. And what I find so fascinating about Faria is how Simon weaves these big kind of philosophical ideas about progress and societal change into her own personal family history.
It's like she's saying, if you want to understand a society, you got to listen to its stories, right? The real lived experiences of everyday people.
Yes, and nobody tells a story quite like Simon. She's got this knack for taking these seemingly ordinary details, these little moments, and revealing this whole other layer of meaning beneath the surface.
Give me an example, like what kind of details?
Well, take the way she talks about death, for instance. It's this constant presence throughout the book, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, now that you mention it, it does seem to pop up a lot.
Grandparents, neighbors, even her brother's pet frog. They all get this full-blown funeral treatment. All these elaborate rituals, these traditions. It makes you wonder, was death just like a more accepted part of life back then?
That's an interesting thought. Like it wasn't so hidden away, so sanitized, you know? It was just this natural part of the cycle of life and death.
Right. And I think it speaks to a different relationship with mortality, don't you think? Like one that's maybe less fearful, more integrated into daily life.
It's definitely a different perspective than what many of us are used to.
For sure. And then you add in Simon's own evolving relationship with faith. Talk
Mhm.
about complex.
Okay, so walk me through that. How does her faith come into play?
So get this. Her parents were atheists, right? But Simon talks about feeling drawn to the rituals of the Catholic Church, even sneaking into communion with her best friend. It's like she's searching for something beyond the tangible, something that connects her to this heritage she's both embracing and questioning at the same time.
It's almost like she's wrestling with the legacy of a Spain that's so deeply rooted in Catholicism, even as it undergoes this period of secularization, trying to reconcile those two things.
Yes. And it reminds me of that story about when her brother's pet frog died. Remember that one?
Vaguely, refresh my memory.
Okay, so her mom, who's a hardcore atheist, right? She stages this full-on funeral for this frog, complete with a crucifix, prayers, music playing in the background.
Wait, seriously, that's hilarious and kind of sweet in a weird way.
It's this bizarrely beautiful moment, and it perfectly captures that blend of irony, sincerity, and deep-seated tradition that just defines Simon's family and maybe even Spanish society as a whole.
It really makes you think about how these traditions, these beliefs run deep, you know, sometimes deeper than any ideology or belief system.
Totally. And it's through these stories, these glimpses into her family's quirks and contradictions, that she allows us to really grasp the complexities of Spanish identity.
It's like a window into a culture, but also a reflection of these universal human experiences, you know?
Absolutely. And it brings us to the crux of what we're going to unpack in the final part of our deep dive. Buckle up, listeners. All right, so we've been tiptoeing around it long enough, but let's just dive right in, shall we? That line from Feria, the one that probably made a few eyebrows shoot up, you know, the one I'm talking about?
Oh, you mean the every woman loves a fascist line? Yeah, that one definitely got people's attention.
It sure did. And honestly, that's what I love about Simon's writing. She's not afraid to be provocative, to make you question your assumptions, even if it ruffles a few feathers along the way.
For sure. She's definitely not one to shy away from controversy.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But it's important to be clear here, right? She's not actually endorsing fascism or anything like that.
Right, of course not. It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. It's like she's using this deliberately provocative statement as a springboard to jump into a much deeper and maybe more uncomfortable conversation about attraction, you know, what we find appealing in other people and why.
I see. So it's more about challenging our preconceived notions about masculinity then.
Precisely. And she sets up this really interesting contrast between the men of her generation, who she describes as like metrosexuals and indies, and the men of her parents' generation.
Okay, so on the one hand, you've got this more modern, maybe more emotionally in tune kind of masculinity. And on the other hand,
You've got the strong, silent types, the Clint Eastwoods, the men of few words.
right, right. And Simon's own father definitely fits into that mold, doesn't he?
Totally. Remember how she describes him? Perfume only on Sundays, Fungusol as the ultimate grooming product? Not exactly a metrosexual poster boy.
Not even close. But here's the thing. Even though he's not like this super polished modern man, Simon is still drawn to something about that older generation of masculinity.
It's that quiet strength, isn't it? That sense of groundedness that she feels is missing in a lot of the men she encounters.
Exactly. And she uses this very specific Spanish term to describe it, the empotrador.
which basically translates to,
Well, it's kind of a loaded term. It literally refers to, well, a very dominant, hypermasculine figure.
wow, okay, she's not holding back.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think it's about glorifying toxic masculinity or anything like that. It's more about acknowledging the complexity of attraction, how sometimes it doesn't neatly align with our intellectual ideals.
Right. Like we can recognize that certain traits are problematic, but still feel drawn to them on some level. It's messy. Human nature is messy.
Exactly. And I think it also challenges this idea that any discussion of traditional masculinity is automatically misogynistic. Simon seems to be arguing that by trying to erase those aspects of masculinity completely, we've maybe lost something valuable along the way.
It's like she's saying, hey, maybe we threw the baby out with the bathwater in our rush to dismantle the patriarchy.
Exactly. And it's a conversation that's happening everywhere, don't you think? Not just in Spain.
Oh, absolutely. Look at popular culture, the resurgence of shows like Yellowstone, the fascination with figures like Jordan Peterson. There's this yearning for a certain kind of masculinity that people feel is missing.
Totally. So where does that leave us? Well, I think Simon would be the first to say she doesn't have all the answers. And honestly, that's what makes Feria so thought-provoking.
It's a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it. It sparks all these questions about family, tradition, the changing roles of men and women in society.
It definitely does. And it reminds us that progress isn't always linear. You know,
Mm,
it's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it involves having these uncomfortable conversations about things we'd rather avoid.
absolutely. And those conversations, as difficult as they can be, are so important.
You really are. Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap things up. But before we go, I want to hear from you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on Simon's take on love, tradition, masculinity, all of it? Head over to our social media pages and share your thoughts. We can't wait to hear from you. Until next time, keep exploring those big questions and keep diving deep.